This is the fourth of 4 videos that teach you how to diagram an argument and then figure out if the argument is any good. Let's start by just kind of going over some of the key concepts from the previous 3 videos. You see on your right a diagram of a hypothetical argument. We've learned how to generate these kinds of diagrams by doing a couple of things. First, we have to figure out what the premises and the conclusions of the argument as it's written out in a paragraph are. Then we list those and number them. We put the premises towards the top and the conclusion at the bottom. We then determine whether or not the connections between the premises and any sub-conclusions and the ultimate conclusion are deductive, as indicated by that brace, or inductive, as indicated by those straight lines. Once we've drawn something like that, we can see how the logic flows from the top of the page down to the bottom. Imagine that such a diagram is kind of like plumbing. Truth gets poured into the very top of anything that's open, which in this case would be premises 1, 2, 4, and 5. Notice that we don't have to pour truth into premise 3. That's going to be supplied to 3 as it comes down through the plumbing from 1 and 2. So down comes the water into the connector between 1 and 2 and flows into 3. Then the truth from 3, 4, and 5, we hope, flows right down those connectors into 6. The goal then is to start with truth at the top and have it flow down through the plumbing to the very bottom without any problems. So what could go wrong? Well, there's 2 distinct kinds of problems you can have. It may be that what you started with at the very top of the diagram isn't true. If you put falsehood into the top of the argument, you're going to end up with an unproven conclusion. Just as if you poured polluted water into the top of that plumbing, you're going to get polluted water at the bottom. Notice that this says that if the initial premises are not true, the conclusion becomes doubtful. It doesn't say that the conclusion is false. A bad argument fails to prove the truth of the conclusion. But it could be that the conclusion is true, and somewhere out there there's this great argument that would prove that. It's just that the argument we're looking at isn't that argument. The other kind of problem you can have is with the plumbing itself. If the connections between premises and conclusions are faulty, then your truth is going to flow out like water through a busted pipe. If the truth does not get down there, the conclusion again becomes doubtful. Now we know there's 2 different kinds of connections, deductive ones and inductive ones. And deductive connections are really special because they absolutely guarantee that if the premises are true, the conclusion is absolutely true. This kind of connection, a good connection between premises and conclusions in a deductive argument, is called valid. If it doesn't work, if the connection between the premises and the conclusions looks like a good deductive argument, but there's a problem, the argument is called invalid. And we call that faulty connection between premises and conclusions a fallacy. Because the connection between premise and conclusion in a deductive argument is 100%, there's only a few ways to do it and to do it correctly. And so we've named them. They all have names. At the same time, there are problems you can have with any one of those named valid forms, and they also have names, and they are called the invalid forms or the fallacies. There's a number of these, and we are only going to learn 3. The first one we're going to learn is modus ponens. Now you'll notice that logic was systematized and written down really well in the Middle Ages. by monks. And so a lot of the terms that we use are in Latin or seem kind of old-fashioned. And you'll just have to bear with that and memorize these words, even if they don't really mean that much to you. So this one is called in Latin modus ponens, and it goes like this. If P, then Q, P, therefore Q. Now this is called a valid deductive form, and you might just think about it the way you think about your tax form or application form or anything like that, where there's fill in the blank spots. In any argument form, there's something you're going to fill in, and we just put a variable there, P, to stand for that. So the important thing is to make sure you put the same thing in every location marked P and a corresponding same thing in the locations marked Q. So let's do that just so you can hear how this is an extremely logical argument. We're going to make P stand for you ate poison, and Q stand for you will become ill. So let's read this off. If you eat poison, then you will become ill. You did eat poison, therefore you will become ill. Now that makes perfect sense, right? That is a valid form. We know that if the premises are true, we have 100% guarantee that the conclusion is also true. A second valid deductive form looks a lot like it and starts out the same way. This one is called modus tollens, and it goes like this. If you eat poison, then you will become ill. You are not ill, therefore you did not eat the poison. Once again, it's a very reasonable argument. Imagine that you had gone to dinner with a bunch of friends and found out later that there was something wrong with some of the dishes, that there was food poisoning there. If an hour later someone says to you, but you're not ill, then you know you didn't eat one of the tainted dishes. So this makes perfect sense. The last of the three valid deductive forms we're going to learn is called Barbara. Yep, I know, it's a woman's name, it's a weird thing, and there's a story behind this, but for now, just memorize it. Here's the form. All S are M, all M are P, therefore all S are P. Now notice that I have made one of these little fill-in-the-blank boxes labeled M. I chose that letter on purpose to indicate that this is the middle term, and that's the term that it's called by. The middle term links the other two, the subject and the predicate of the conclusion, and it must be there, and it must be in a particular relation for that link to work. So this, Barbara, is a valid deductive form with the middle term in the right location. This is the form of that famous argument we looked at earlier that says Socrates is human, all humans are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. For each of these valid deductive forms, there is a similar looking invalid form, something where there's a fallacy, a mistake, that makes the connection not work. For example, here's modus ponens on your left. If you eat the poison, then you'll be ill. You ate the poison, therefore you're ill. Look at the fallacy of affirming the consequent. All right, let's define these terms. In an if-then statement, the first part, the P, is called the antecedent, which is just a fancy word for the thing that comes first. The antecedent, if the antecedent happens, then the consequent or consequence follows. Makes perfect sense, right? So you'll notice over in modus ponens, we start with if P then Q, so P is the antecedent, and we affirm the antecedent. We say, yes, it's true, P happened, therefore Q. The invalid form makes the mistake of affirming the wrong half of the if-then statement. It affirms the consequent. Let's listen to it with our example about poison. If you eat the poison, then you will be ill. You are ill. Therefore, you must have eaten the poison. Now imagine that you had gone to this dinner with friends and you were coming down with the flu. It is possible that you could eat the dinner with your friends, not eat any of the poison, and still feel sick later because you have the flu. Since there's this loophole, a way out of this, this can't be a valid deductive form. Deductive forms, if they're valid, 100% guarantee the conclusion is true. There's no way out. And here, there are many logical explanations for why you might be ill that have nothing to do with eating the poison. You might have measles. You could have picked up an STD. You might have eczema. Who knows? But you didn't eat the poison. So since there is a way out of this, this is not 100% lock solid, it is invalid and should not be used. Now let's look at modus tollens and its corresponding fallacy. Notice here it's the fallacy of denying the antecedent. Let's look back over at modus tollens and you'll see that there is a denial in the not cue. But that's a denial of the consequent of the cue. And it's easy to make the mistake of denying the antecedent instead, but this doesn't work. Look at the form on the right, the fallacy of denying the antecedent, and let's read it with our poison example, and you'll see how it doesn't work. If you eat the poison, then you will be ill. You did not eat the poison, therefore you will not be ill. Well, for the same reason as in the previous example, this doesn't work because you could catch the flu, even if you didn't eat the poison, so you could still be ill. This is an invalid form and again should not be used. But notice how close these sound to the valid forms. It's easy to do these by accident or for an author to do it by accident. You may find yourself reading an article or reading an argument somewhere and thinking, that sounds logical. But if you look at it carefully, you'll see it's actually an invalid argument form. And that's why it's important to learn these. Last, let's look at Barbara and what can go wrong with Barbara. Here is an invalid form called an excluded middle. All that means is that the middle term is not linked up tightly enough to guarantee the truth of the conclusion. In Barbara, over on the left, we said Socrates is human. All humans are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal, and that worked for us just fine. But look at the one over on the right. It might say Socrates is human. Phaedrus is human, therefore Socrates is Phaedrus? No, that doesn't make any sense. But again, this is a mistake sometimes made. If you want a really humorous example of excluded middles, you can watch the movie Monty Python and the Search for the Holy Grail, and you will see that they can prove that a woman is a witch because she weighs the same as a duck. And of course they do it fallaciously by using excluded middles throughout. It's a lot of fun. I recommend the film. Okay, so let's take all these skills that we've just learned and apply them to an actual argument. In the previous videos, we had this argument put forth by someone who wants to prove that John is not guilty of murder because he has an alibi. So let's look at this. If someone is home, the lights would be on. The lights were on at the time of the murder. Therefore, someone, in this case John, was home at the time of the murder, and therefore John has an alibi. Now, we want to determine whether or not this is valid, so we're going to compare it to all of the valid argument forms we've just learned, and also obviously compare it to the invalid ones and make sure it's not one of those. What shall we compare it to? Well, it's an if-then, so it's either modus ponens or modus tollens. There's no negation. There's no nots or no's or things like that. Everything here is affirmed. So this argument is either a nice, valid modus ponens, or it's an invalid fallacy of affirming the consequent. Take a moment and look at it. See if you can figure out how you would write it out as an if something, then something kind of argument, and tell me which one it is. If you want to, pause the video now, think it through, and when you're ready, come back, and I'll tell you what I'm seeing here. Okay, so let's call someone is home H, and the lights would be on L. If we do that, then this is how it would read. If H, then L. Then the lights were on at the time of the murder would just be L. Therefore, H. So going back to the conditional statement, if H, then L. H is the antecedent, and L is the consequent. The next premise is L. Uh-oh, we're affirming the consequent. So now we know this is a fallacious argument. Let's remember, however, that there are two problems you can have with any argument. You can have a problem with the connections, which we've already discussed, or the premises may be a problem. If one of the premises is false, then the conclusion is not proven. So let's look at this argument once again. There are two premises we need to check. If someone is home, the lights would be on, and the lights were on at the time of the murder. Now we're just going to give the author the second premise, the lights were on at the time of the murder. This is an empirical question, which we would need some kind of evidence to establish, maybe a photograph of the house at the time. But let's look at that first one, the conditional statement, if someone is home, the lights would be on. Is that necessarily true? In my own home, we are often all home and all the lights are out because it's 3 a.m. and everybody's sleeping. We also might have all the lights off because it's the middle of the day and we don't need them. We could be having a candlelight dinner and have all the lights off. The electricity could have been cut by a storm or something. There's so many ways I can think of that someone can be home and the lights not be on, that I know that this premise is not true. And since the premise is not true, the conclusion has not been proven. So now we get to the concept of soundness. If the argument is valid, in other words, the connections are good, and the premises are true, we can call the argument sound. That is our ultimate goal. Now let's talk about inductive connections. Inductive arguments are different than deductive arguments. A deductive argument guarantees the truth of its conclusion if it's valid and the premises are true. So it's either absolutely perfect or it's wrong. There is no middle ground. But with an inductive argument, what you have is a spectrum from weak to strong. There will be arguments at the furthest end of that are absolutely strong. Anyone who reads it will say, yeah, that's a strong argument, and I'm fairly convinced that the conclusion is true. And there will be other arguments on the other end that are clearly weak, and everyone will agree, that's weak. I am not convinced that the conclusion is true. And then there's going to be an awful lot of arguments right in the middle that some people will say are strong enough, and some people will say, no, it's too weak. So this is more of a spectrum situation than deductive arguments, which are just on or off. If an inductive argument does have enough evidence and the connections between that evidence and the conclusion are clear, then we call it strong. If on top of that, all of that evidence, all those premises are true, we call it cogent. So what can go wrong with the connection? Sometimes you might have wonderful evidence, but it doesn't prove the conclusion you are trying to establish. So let's talk about some ways in which there's no real connection between the premises and the conclusions in an inductive argument. We're only going to cover a few of these fallacies. There are hundreds, but here are some of the most common ones. The straw person fallacy is a fallacy when you create a kind of facsimile of another person's argument and then destroy it, thereby proving that they're wrong and perhaps you are right. The problem with this is it's kind of like if I wanted to beat up a boxing champ and I said, oh, I want to beat this guy up, and I can't do it, right? I just can't. I'm not that strong. So what I do is I build a little scarecrow out of straw, looks just like the guy, dress him up in the same outfit that the guy normally wears in the ring, and then I stand up in front of everybody and go, watch me tear this guy apart, and I tear apart my scarecrow. Well, that's not really that impressive because the actual boxer is standing off to the side here, completely untouched. This is what happens in these arguments. Now, you get these arguments frequently in the world of politics, for example. One politician will put forth a suggestion for a legislation, let's say, and it's got a lot of provisions in it, and it's very complicated, and there's a lot of reasoning behind why these provisions were chosen. And you may agree with that bill or not, but you are making a fallacy if you oversimplify it and turn that whole argument into like one simple, like, well, he just wants to do this, and then say, but that's stupid. Well, yeah, that's stupid, but that's not what the guy proposed. So it's really important that when you read someone critiquing another person, that you check and make sure that they have accurately represented the other person's position or argument. Another fallacy that can be made is a hasty generalization. This happens when someone makes a claim about an entire category of people or events or things based on only a few examples, or maybe examples that are not very representative. So you might say have an exchange student come to the United States and you meet this person and you go, wow, you are so smart. And you're from where? Oh, you're from Ghana? Oh, well, everyone in Africa must be so smart. Well, it may be that in fact everyone in Africa is very smart, but you haven't proven it by one example. That's one person, and you're generalizing that over an entire continent of people. That's called a hasty generalization. Another fallacy that you can commit is circular reasoning. This is where you actually use the conclusion of the argument as a premise. Now, this rarely happens overtly. Someone isn't going to just go ahead and say, because what I'm trying to prove is true, what I'm trying to prove is true. That's too obvious. But we can fall into this almost by accident when there is an assumed or unstated premise in the argument. You might not have said it, but it's there, and the argument won't work without it. And then once you put that in, you realize, oh, this is circular reasoning. Let me give you an example that's actually fairly common. Someone might come to you and say, hey, the Bible is infallible, and I can prove that because God wrote the Bible. And that sounds like a great argument. Surely if God wrote a book, it would be an infallible book. But then you have to ask the question, how do you know that God wrote the Bible? And you say, well, it says so right here in the Bible. And then they say, well, how do I know I can trust what that Bible is saying, that claiming this, that it's written by God? Well, because it's infallible. And how do I know it's infallible? Because God wrote it. And so then you start to see that you're going in a circle. And so it's really easy to fall into this, but you have to keep your eyes open for it. Another fallacy is the ad hominem attack, also very popular in politics. This is where your opponent makes a brilliant claim, a wonderful argument, or has an interesting position, and instead of attacking the claim or the argument or the position, you turn around and say, yeah, well, you're a jerk, you know. And this happens sometimes in politics where people are running against each other for elected office, and one of them has all sorts of interesting programs and policies that she or he is putting out, and the other person just says, yeah, but you had an affair. That's not really attacking the positions or policies that the other candidate holds. Now we get more Latin. Don't we love that? Okay, here it is. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. If I translate that into English, what it says is, after that, therefore, because of that. And the mistake made here is that you see two things happen in sequence. And so you say, oh, one was the cause of the other. But you really don't have evidence of a causal relation, just of a temporal one. So, for example, one argument that sometimes gets made is that people will point to the social movements of the 50s and the 60s, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, that kind of thing, and then point to another event further down in history like the economic downturn of 2008. And then they'll say, oh, look, if we hadn't, opened up our society in this way in the 50s and 60s, we wouldn't have this economic downturn. When you have to trace how it is that perhaps having more women in the workforce contributed to the economic downturn. That may be an argument you can make, but you can't just say because one happened first and then the second one happened afterwards that it's clearly caused by the first one. Last, we'll talk about slippery slope. In this case, you imagine the situation you're in as a slippery slope, and if you take one step in any direction, you're going to slide all the way down to the bottom. In fact, reality is probably much more like, regular even ground or hills that you can take a few steps in one direction and then go back up to the top. You can move in all sorts of directions. To claim that you're going to slide all the way down to the bottom if you take one step in any direction is really to claim some really extreme situations, and you would have to prove that the situation is in fact that extreme. Let me give you an example that's fairly common. As more and more states are considering making gay marriage legal, you will sometimes hear people argue, but if we allow people to marry people of the same sex, we will also have to let them marry their pets or inanimate objects or imaginary people and so on and so on. In other words, if we take one step in the direction of loosening up the restrictions on who you can marry, we have to go all the way and let you marry anything and anybody. And that's just not true. We definitely can make laws. We've had laws for a long time drawing some lines that you had to be, for example, an adult to get married. And in many states, you have to be a member of the opposite sex and, all these kinds of things. So if we add a different stipulation, we won't have to go and remove all stipulations entirely. So that's a fallacy. None of these are good arguments. If you see any of these happening in an inductive argument, you can say the connections between the premises and the conclusion are fallacious, and that makes the argument weak. So let's summarize the vocabulary we've learned. If a deductive argument has good connections, that's just that little bracket. If that bracket is a good bracket, we call it valid. If on top of the bracket being good, so it's valid, we know that the two premises are true, then the argument is sound. And a sound argument absolutely establishes the truth of its conclusion. You have to accept the conclusion as true if it is a sound argument. On the inductive side, if there is sufficient evidence and the evidence is clearly connected to the conclusion, we can call that argument strong. And if it is strong and we can claim that each premise, or at least most of them, are true, we have a cogent argument. In a cogent argument, we have established that the conclusion is highly probable. It's probably true, and you should act on it, most likely. It's good advice. We can't 100% guarantee it. More evidence could come to light, but this is a really strong argument, so I would go with it. So that's it. You've finished all 4 videos. You're ready to go out, diagram and analyze arguments, and be able to discuss issues that are very complex with other people carefully and logically. Congratulations.